Imagine this. You wake up one morning in a bustling medieval town. Birds are chirping, merchants shout their wares, and life seems normal until someone collapses in the street. They're feverish. Their lymph nodes are swollen like eggs under their arms and neck. Within days, they're dead. And then it starts happening again and again. Soon, half your village is gone. This was the Black Death, or as medieval doctors called it, pestilencia, the pestilence. It arrived in Europe in 1347 and swept across the continent with terrifying speed. In just 6 years, it killed up to 50% of Europe's population. That's around 200 million people. People had no idea what caused it. They thought it came from bad air, angry gods, or even astrology. Some believed it was divine punishment for sins. Others blamed witches or Jews, leading to mass killings and hysteria. The disease struck fast. Victims would see black bruises bloom across their skin, signs of internal bleeding. They'd cough blood. Screams echoed through homes as families watched loved ones die in agony. There was no cure, no medicine, only death. And worst of all, you could catch it just by being near someone, breathing the same air, touching the same door handle, sharing a meal. Medieval cities became graveyards. Graves were dug in mass pits. Dogs roamed the streets feeding on corpses. Priests refused to give last rites out of fear. The stench of death was everywhere. Survivors tried everything to escape it. Some fled to the countryside. Others locked themselves indoors. Some wore masks shaped like birds, filled with herbs they thought would filter out the bad air. But nothing worked. This wasn't just a disease. It was apocalypse on Earth. Imagine waking up one morning and noticing a strange patch of numb skin on your arm. It doesn't hurt, doesn't itch, but it's different. You ignore it. Days pass, the patch grows, your fingers start to feel stiff, you drop things. People begin to stare. Then comes the worst part. Your body starts turning against you. Fingers curl into claws, toes fall off, flesh rots from the inside out. This wasn't witchcraft. It wasn't punishment from the gods. It was leprosy, or as we now know it, Hansen's disease. In medieval Europe, lepers were feared more than plague victims, not because they died quickly, but because they lived in slow, visible decay. People didn't understand how it spread. Some believed it was airborne. Others thought it was hereditary or divine punishment for sin. Whatever the cause, the result was always the same: banishment. Lepers were forced to live outside town walls, in colonies called leper houses or lazarettos. They wore special clothing to mark themselves, often with bells sewn onto their robes, so healthy townsfolk could hear them coming and flee. They weren't just sick, they were socially dead. Even the church got involved. Priests performed a ritual called the living burial, treating lepers like corpses before they even died. And yet, people tried to survive. Some built their own communities, others begged at roadsides, hoping for scraps. A few managed to hide their symptoms long enough to live normal lives, until the disease betrayed them. Medieval doctors had no cure. Their treatments ranged from useless to horrifying. They tried bloodletting. They applied poultices made of animal dung. One remedy suggested bathing in urine every day. None of it worked. But the worst part? Many who were accused of having leprosy didn't actually have it. Misdiagnosis was common. Skin conditions like eczema or psoriasis were enough to get you cast out. So next time you worry about acne or a rash, imagine if that meant exile, shame, and a life alone in the wilderness. Because that was leprosy in the Middle Ages. A slow death. A lonely death, and for many, an unjust one. Let's say you survived the plague, you avoided lepers and their cursed bells, you even managed to keep your fingers. But then, one morning, you wake up with a high fever. Your body aches like you've run for miles in armor. You feel weak, dizzy, nauseous. 2 days later, it starts. Red spots appear on your face, then your arms, then everywhere. They grow into painful blisters filled with pus. Within a week, you're unrecognizable. Your skin burned and scarred for life. This was smallpox, one of the most disfiguring diseases of the medieval world. Unlike the Black Death, which killed quickly, smallpox left survivors alive, but marked forever. In the Middle Ages, beauty was power. and smallpox didn't care. Kings, queens, nobles, and commoners alike could lose everything to this invisible monster. Not just their lives, but their faces. There was no cure, no vaccine, just suffering. And if you were lucky enough to survive, you'd live the rest of your life hiding behind veils, or worse, being shunned by society. Medieval people didn't understand how smallpox spread. Some believed it came from bad air or divine punishment. Others thought it was contagious, but had no idea how to stop it. What they did know? Once someone broke out in rash, the disease would sweep through villages like wildfire. Children were especially vulnerable. Many died before reaching adulthood. Those who lived often bore deep scars that turned them into social outcasts. Treatment? Typically useless. Doctors tried everything from bloodletting to herbal poultices. Some wrapped patients in red cloth, thinking it would draw the infection out. Others gave them mixtures made from crushed pearls or ground-up deer antlers. None of it helped. What made smallpox so terrifying wasn't just its brutality. It was its randomness. You couldn't bribe it away. You couldn't pray it off. You couldn't hide from it. It struck the rich and poor alike. Even royalty fell victim. One of history's most famous smallpox survivors was Mary I of England, known as Bloody Mary. She contracted the disease at age 16, and her face was permanently scarred. Her portraits show a woman who lived in pain and fear of judgment. Imagine living in a world where a single illness could ruin your future, where your reflection became a prison. That was smallpox in the Middle Ages, a disease that didn't just steal life, it stole identity. You've survived the plague, escaped the horrors of leprosy, endured smallpox and its scars. But now, you wake up with a cramp in your stomach. Then it hits. Violent vomiting, explosive diarrhea, a fever so high you feel like you're burning from the inside out. Within hours, your body is drained. Your lips turn blue. Your eyes sink into your skull. You're alive, but barely. This was cholera, one of the most terrifying diseases to strike medieval towns, and one of the fastest killers. Unlike the Black Death, which took days or weeks to kill, cholera could end your life in less than a day. It didn't care who you were, rich or poor, noble or peasant, healthy or weak. If you drank the wrong water, you were doomed. Cholera was caused by a tiny enemy that medieval people couldn't even see: contaminated water. Imagine walking to the well for a drink after a long day of work. The water looks clean, smells fine, but it's crawling with bacteria. One sip. That's all it took. The disease attacked your digestive system, draining every drop of fluid from your body. Victims died not from pain, but from dehydration so severe it turned them into mummies while still alive. Medieval doctors had no idea what they were dealing with. They called it the Blue Death because victims' skin turned bluish from dehydration. They blamed everything from bad air to witchcraft. Some believed it was punishment for immoral behavior. Others thought it came from the stars. Their treatments? As useless as trying to stop the tide with a broom. They tried bloodletting. They wrapped patients in ice-cold cloths. Some gave them vinegar mixed with ashes, thinking it would cleanse the body. None of it worked. What made cholera especially cruel was how it struck communities, suddenly, silently, and without mercy. One person gets sick, then their family, then the neighbors. Soon, entire villages were dying in agony, one after another. In cities, the situation was even worse. There was no sewage system, no clean water supply. People lived on top of waste, animals, and rotting food. Rivers were open sewers. Wells were dug near cesspits. So when cholera hit, there was no escape. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. Priests refused to visit the sick. Parents buried their own children. Survivors whispered stories of entire families found dead in their beds, still holding hands. Cholera wasn't just a disease. It was liquid terror. Imagine this. You've survived the horrors of medieval food, endured the unsanitary living conditions, and even managed to avoid getting caught in a war. But then, you start feeling feverish. Your head pounds. Your body aches. You can't stop shivering. Days later, your skin breaks out in red spots. They spread like wildfire across your chest, arms, and legs. Your eyes become bloodshot. You feel dizzy, confused, and utterly exhausted. This was typhus, one of the most insidious diseases of the Middle Ages, a silent killer that struck when people were already at their weakest. Typhus wasn't just a disease, it was a plague of poverty. The silent assassin typhus is caused by bacteria carried by lice. In modern times, we know how to prevent it. But in medieval Europe, lice were everywhere. They infested clothes, bedding, and bodies, and they thrived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Medieval people didn't understand germs or hygiene. They had no idea that lice could carry deadly bacteria. All they knew was that typhus struck hardest where people lived in close quarters. Camps. During wars, armies camped together in cramped tents. Soldiers shared blankets, slept shoulder to shoulder, and rarely washed. Lice flourished. Cities. In medieval towns, overcrowding was the norm. Houses were packed with families, servants, and sometimes even livestock. Trash piled up in streets, and sewage ran freely. Lice loved these environments. Prisons. Jails were dark, damp, and filthy. Prisoners shared beds, clothing, and lice. Typhus outbreaks were common. Symptoms and suffering. Typhus hit fast and hard. Within days, victims experienced high fever, severe headaches, muscle pain, rash, red spots spreading across the body, confusion and delirium, extreme fatigue. Victims often died within weeks. Those who survived were left weak and vulnerable to other illnesses. What made typhus so terrifying? 1. Silent spread. It could strike without warning. One infected person could infect an entire camp or village. 2. Misdiagnosis. Medieval doctors had no idea what caused typhus. They thought it came from bad air, witchcraft, or divine punishment. 3. No cure. There were no effective treatments. Doctors tried everything from bloodletting to herbal remedies. None worked. The impact on history typhus wasn't just a disease, it shaped history. Wars. During sieges and battles, typhus killed more soldiers than swords or arrows. Entire armies were decimated not by enemy forces, but by lice. Cities. Outbreaks in medieval towns wiped out entire neighborhoods. Some historians believe typhus contributed to the decline of major cities. Social chaos. Victims became delirious and confused. Families watched loved ones lose their minds before dying. Survivors were left traumatized. A disease of poverty. Typhus didn't care about wealth or status. It struck everyone, from peasants to nobles. But it hit the poor hardest. Peasants living in crowded hovels. Soldiers sleeping in muddy camps. Prisoners chained in dungeons. For them, typhus was just another reminder of how fragile life was. Conclusion. Typhus was a silent killer that preyed on weakness. It showed how intertwined medieval life was with poverty, war, and poor sanitation. Even if you survived the plague, leprosy, smallpox, and cholera, typhus might still get you. And yet, there was something worse waiting. Imagine this. You wake up one morning feeling fine, a bit tired maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then you notice it, a small sore on your body, painless at first. But days pass, and suddenly a rash spreads across your skin. You feel feverish, weak, your joints ache, and then things get worse, much worse. This was syphilis, known in medieval times as the Great Pox, and it was unlike any disease people had seen before. A new kind of horror, syphilis, appeared in Europe near the end of the 15th century, around 1494, and spread like wildfire. Historians still debate its origin, but some believe it came to Europe from the Americas via returning explorers. Unlike the plague or cholera, which killed quickly, syphilis was slow and sneaky. It crept through the body in stages, attacking everything from skin and bones to the brain itself. It didn't care who you were: nobles, priests, soldiers, prostitutes. Even monks weren't safe. Once infected, there was no escape. The stages of decay. The disease followed a terrifying pattern. 1. Primary stage. A painless sore appears where the infection entered the body, often on the genitals, mouth, or hands. 2nd stage. A full-body rash appears, along with fever, fatigue, and hair loss. This could last weeks or disappear for months. 3rd latent stage. No symptoms. The victim feels fine. They might even think they're cured. 4th tertiary stage. Years later, the disease returns with vengeance. Tumors form under the skin. Bones rot. The nose collapses. Vision fails. And eventually, madness. Yes, madness. Syphilis could eat away at the brain, causing hallucinations, paranoia, and dementia. Some victims screamed in agony for days before dying. Doctors had no idea what was happening. They thought it was divine punishment for immoral behavior. Others believed it was caused by astrology, that a rare planetary alignment had cursed humanity. But the worst part? It was contagious at every stage. Even when someone seemed healthy, they could pass it on. a disease of shame and fear. Because syphilis was often transmitted sexually, it became deeply stigmatized. Victims were shunned, marriages were ruined, and reputations destroyed. Prostitutes were blamed, unfairly in many cases, and entire brothels were shut down in panic. Some cities passed laws forcing sex workers to be regularly inspected. Soldiers were especially vulnerable. During wars, outbreaks swept through camps like wildfire. In fact, some historians believe syphilis played a role in deciding the outcome of battles. More men died from disease than from swords. Medieval cures that made things worse. With no real understanding of bacteria or germs, medieval doctors turned to horrifying treatments. Mercury, applied as ointments, inhaled as vapor, or even swallowed. Mercury poisoning caused tooth loss, neurological damage, and sometimes death. Sweating rooms. Patients were locked in hot, humid rooms to sweat out the disease, often leading to dehydration and heat stroke. Herbal remedies. Mixtures of garlic, vinegar, and tree bark were used, though none worked consistently. One treatment involved wrapping patients in blankets soaked in mercury and leaving them in the sun, hoping the heat would force the poison into their bodies and kill the disease. Spoiler, it mostly just poisoned them faster. Legacy of suffering syphilis didn't just affect individuals. It shaped culture, medicine, and morality for centuries. In literature, it became a symbol of hidden corruption, a disease that looked clean on the outside but rotted you from within. In art, it inspired haunting portraits of victims whose faces had collapsed from infection. And in medicine, it pushed scientists to search for better cures, eventually leading to the discovery of antibiotics centuries later. But in the Middle Ages, there was no cure, no prevention, only fear. And if you caught it, your fate was sealed. You've survived the plague, escaped leprosy's exile, outlived smallpox's scars, avoided cholera's dehydration and typhus's fever. But now, you start coughing, not just any cough, a deep, rattling cough that won't go away. You feel tired all the time. You're losing weight, and at night, you wake up drenched in sweat. This wasn't a cold. It wasn't the flu. It was tuberculosis, known in medieval times as the White Plague. The silent killer. Tuberculosis is an ancient disease. It existed long before the Middle Ages, but it thrived in them. In medieval Europe, tuberculosis didn't strike fast like the Black Death. It burned slowly, quietly, for months or even years. Victims watched themselves waste away, their cheeks hollowed, their skin turned pale. They coughed blood into rags. People called it consumption because it consumed its victims from within. There was no cure, no way to stop it. Only time. How it spread TB spread through the air, just by breathing. In medieval homes, people lived packed together in one-room huts. Beds were shared. Blankets passed from one sick person to another. Windows stayed closed in winter out of fear of bad air. With no understanding of germs or infection control, TB moved silently from house to house, village to village. Even castles weren't safe. Nobles and peasants alike caught it. Some died in weeks. Others lingered for years. One famous sufferer was Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland. He may have fought bravely in battle, but eventually, it was consumption that took him down. Medieval misunderstandings. Medieval doctors had no idea what caused TB. They thought it came from bad air, hereditary weakness, emotional grief, astrological misalignments. Some believed it was contagious, but they didn't know how. So their treatments? Useless, often dangerous. Doctors prescribed drinking cow's milk from healthy cows, breathing fresh mountain air if you could afford to travel, wearing amulets made from animal bones or herbs, bloodletting, because blood was always the problem. Some victims tried to hide their symptoms for as long as possible. But when the coughing fits started in public, everyone knew, and they stayed away. The tragedy of children TB was especially cruel to children. It attacked their spines, causing permanent damage. Some grew up hunched or crippled. Others went blind or deaf. Parents watched helplessly as their children faded away. There was nothing they could do. TB didn't care about love or prayers or social status. It simply took what it wanted. A disease of poverty and darkness. Tuberculosis thrived where people were weakest. Poorly ventilated homes, malnourished bodies, overworked lungs from labor. Medieval life offered no escape. If you were poor, you were more likely to catch it. If you worked indoors, more likely. If you lived in a city, even worse. TB wasn't just a disease. It was a symptom of everything wrong with medieval life. Legacy of loss. By the end of the Middle Ages, tuberculosis had killed millions. It left behind generations of empty beds, broken families, and whispered warnings. Don't share your cup. Avoid those who cough too much. If your child looks too thin, get them outside. None of it helped, but still people hoped, because sometimes, if you were lucky, you didn't catch it. You've survived the Black Death, escaped leprosy's exile, outlived smallpox and syphilis, avoided cholera and tuberculosis. But now, you're in the middle of a war camp. The smell is unbearable. The food is questionable. And suddenly your stomach twists. This was dysentery, one of the most brutal diseases to strike medieval armies and towns alike. Unlike the plague or typhus, which spread silently through air and lice, dysentery struck where people lived in filth, and nowhere was that more common than in the battlefields and camps of the Middle Ages. The enemy within dysentery is caused by bacteria or parasites that infect the intestines. It spreads through contaminated food and water, exactly the kind of things soldiers and peasants had no control over. Imagine this. A soldier drinks from a river downstream from where his comrades relieve themselves. A peasant eats bread made with grain stored near rotting waste. A child drinks from a well unknowingly polluted by infected feces. One sip, one bite, that's all it took. Within days, victims were hit with violent diarrhea, often filled with blood and mucus, severe abdominal pain, fever, dehydration so bad it could kill within a week. There was no dignity in dying from dysentery. Victims lay in their own filth. They screamed in agony, they begged for help, and no one could do anything. A soldier's worst nightmare. In war, dysentery was a silent killer. It didn't care if you were a knight in armor or a foot soldier with a spear. It didn't wait for battle. It struck before the first sword was drawn. During the 100 Years' War, dysentery killed more men than actual combat. At the siege of Orléans, thousands of French and English troops died not from arrows or swords, but from bloody stools and feverish chills. Even kings weren't safe. King John of England reportedly died from dysentery after eating a surfeit of peaches and new ale during a military campaign. No heroic last stand, no glorious death, just pain and humiliation. Soldiers called it the bloody flux. And they feared it more than any enemy army. Cities were no safer. Outside of war, dysentery thrived in medieval cities. Streets were open sewers. Wells were dug too close to cesspits. Food was left out in the heat, attracting flies that carried disease. Children were especially vulnerable. Their bodies were weaker, their immune systems undeveloped. Many died before their 5th birthday, not from war or famine, but from a simple stomach infection we can cure today with antibiotics. Medieval doctors had no idea what caused dysentery. Some believed it came from bad air. Others thought it was punishment for sin. A few tried to treat it with herbal remedies, often making things worse. Treatments included drinking vinegar mixed with ashes, eating raw garlic, applying poultices made from animal dung, bloodletting, because, of course, none of it worked. All it did was delay the inevitable. A disease of filth and despair. Dysentery wasn't just a disease. It was a symptom of everything wrong with medieval life. Poor sanitation, lack of clean water, ignorance of germs. Victims didn't die because they were weak. They died because they lived in a world that couldn't protect them. And if you caught it, there was only one question left. How long will you suffer before it takes you? You've survived the Black Death, escaped leprosy's exile, outlived smallpox, syphilis, and cholera, avoided dysentery and tuberculosis. But now, you wake up with a fever. 1 minute, you're shivering uncontrollably. The next, you're sweating like you've run for miles in armor. Your head pounds, your muscles ache. And no matter how much you rest, the fever keeps coming back, again and again. This was malaria, one of the most persistent and misunderstood diseases of medieval times. A hidden threat. Malaria wasn't as fast or dramatic as the plague or cholera. It didn't leave scars like smallpox. It didn't rot your flesh like typhus. But it haunted people for years. It drained their strength. It made every day feel like a hangover from hell. In medieval Europe, malaria was especially common in wet, swampy regions, places where mosquitoes thrived, southern Italy, the Netherlands, parts of England near rivers and marshes. People didn't know what caused it. They called it ague or marsh fever. Some believed it came from bad air rising off swamps, hence the name malaria, Italian for bad air. But they were wrong. It was carried by mosquitoes, tiny insects that injected a deadly parasite into the bloodstream. Victims could suffer for years, waking up to feverish chills, collapsing from exhaustion, only to recover enough to be struck down again. There was no escape, only suffering. Symptoms that came in waves. Malaria hit in cycles. First came the chill. Victims would shiver violently, teeth clattering even under thick blankets. Then the fever. Temperatures soared so high, victims became delirious, seeing visions or hearing voices. Finally, the sweating. Drenched in sweat, exhausted, barely able to stand, but never truly healed. Each attack could last hours or days. Then silence. Until the next wave came. Some people developed partial immunity over time. Others weren't so lucky. Children were especially vulnerable. Many died before reaching adulthood. Survivors often lived with weakness, anemia, and recurring illness for the rest of their lives. Medieval misunderstandings. Since medieval doctors had no idea about parasites or mosquitoes, they blamed everything else. Some said it came from living too close to swamps, eating spoiled food, sinning against God. Treatments ranged from useless to horrifying. Doctors prescribed drinking vinegar mixed with wine, wearing amulets filled with herbs, sitting near burning sulfur to cleanse the air. Bloodletting, because blood was always the problem. In some places, people tried to ward off malaria by hanging garlic around their necks, a superstition that may have actually helped a little, since garlic repels insects. But the real answer, stopping mosquitoes, remained unknown for centuries. Impact on daily life. Malaria wasn't just a disease, it shaped life in medieval Europe. Farming villages near wetlands suffered the most. During harvest season, entire communities collapsed from fever. Fields went untended. Crops rotted. Famine followed. Soldiers caught it during campaigns. Armies lost more men to fever than to swords. Even nobles weren't safe. Kings and queens fell ill without warning. Royal records show rulers retreating to dry, mountainous areas to escape the fevers. Some historians believe malaria played a role in the fall of the Roman Empire, weakening armies, slowing trade, and draining the population. A disease of silence. Unlike the plague, which killed quickly and left visible signs, malaria lingered in the shadows. No one kept track of how many died. No one mourned them publicly. Their deaths were silent, buried in church records, forgotten in history. But for those who lived through it, they remembered. Every time the chills returned, every time the fever took hold, they knew. The disease was still there, waiting. You've survived the plague, escaped leprosy's exile, outlived smallpox, syphilis, and cholera, avoided dysentery, tuberculosis, and malaria. But now, you wake up with a strange numbness in your fingers. Your vision blurs, your stomach churns, and suddenly, you're seeing things that aren't there. This wasn't madness. It wasn't witchcraft. It was ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire, and it was one of the most terrifying diseases of the Middle Ages. The hidden killer in your bread. Imagine this. You're a medieval peasant. You work from dawn to dusk. You earn just enough to buy bread, your only reliable meal of the day. The bread looks normal, smells fine, tastes like usual. But something is very, very wrong. Hidden in the rye flour is a deadly fungus called ergot, which grows on grains under certain weather conditions. It thrives in cold, damp climates, perfect for parts of Europe in the Middle Ages. And when people ate the infected bread, they didn't know they were eating poison. Ergot contains powerful chemicals, including ones similar to LSD. In small doses, it caused hallucinations. In large doses, it killed. The symptoms that seemed like witchcraft. Victims of ergot poisoning suffered horrifying symptoms. Hallucinations. People saw demons, angels, monsters. Convulsions. They twitched uncontrollably, foamed at the mouth. Burning sensations. Their limbs felt like they were on fire. Gangrene. Blood flow stopped to their hands and feet. Fingers and toes rotted and fell off. Madness. Some victims screamed until they lost their voices. Others became paranoid and violent. Medieval doctors had no idea what was happening. Some believed it was divine punishment. Others thought it was possession by evil spirits. Many towns thought they were under attack by witches. Entire villages would break out in mass hysteria, dancing wildly, screaming about demons, tearing off their clothes. Historians today believe some famous witch trials and even the Salem witch trials may have been fueled by ergot poisoning. Yes, a bad loaf of bread could get you burned at the stake. St. Anthony's fire. Because so many victims developed gangrene and blackened limbs, the disease was often called St. Anthony's fire. St. Anthony was the patron saint of those suffering from burning pain. People prayed to him for help. Hospitals dedicated to St. Anthony began appearing across Europe, especially in France and Austria, where monks tried to care for the sick. But they had no cure, no medicine, only prayer, clean air, and hope. Some victims recovered if they stopped eating the infected grain in time. Others weren't so lucky. Their limbs turned black, rotted, fell off, Survivors were left disfigured for life. Why did it happen? Ergot thrived in the wet, cool summers and warm, humid autumns of medieval Europe. Poor storage conditions made things worse. Grain was stored in damp barns or cellars, perfect for fungal growth. And because rye was one of the few crops that grew well in poor soil, it was the main grain for peasants. So every harvest season, people unknowingly baked death into their bread. There was no warning label, no food safety inspection, just hunger and a desperate need to eat. A disease of madness and misunderstanding. What made ergotism so terrifying wasn't just its physical effects, it was the psychological terror it created. Imagine waking up in a village where half the people are screaming at invisible demons, where children dance naked in the streets, laughing and crying at once, where neighbors accuse each other of being possessed. That was ergotism, a silent killer hiding in the most basic part of daily life, food. And in the Middle Ages, there was no escape, only fear, only suffering, and sometimes, only fire. You've survived the horrors of plague and leprosy, escaped smallpox's scars and cholera's dehydration, avoided typhus, syphilis, tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, and ergotism. But now, your child wakes up with a sore throat. They seem fine at first, maybe a little tired. Then comes the fever, and then a bright red rash spreads across their body like fire. This was scarlet fever, one of the most feared childhood diseases of the medieval world, and for good reason. The killer in every home scarlet fever wasn't just a disease, it was a terror that struck every family, especially those with young children. In medieval Europe, it was known as the Red Death, not to be confused with the fictional Red Death from Edgar Allan Poe, but just as deadly in its own way. Caused by the Streptococcus bacteria, scarlet fever spread like wildfire through homes, schools, and villages. It didn't care if you were rich or poor. If you lived in close quarters, you were vulnerable. There was no vaccine, no antibiotics, just fear. And once it took hold in a household, there was no stopping it. Symptoms that terrified parents. The disease began like any other sore throat. Sudden high fever, severe headache, nausea and vomiting. Then came the telltale sign, a bright red rash that started on the neck and chest before spreading across the entire body. The skin felt hot and rough, like sandpaper. In severe cases, it peeled away like sunburned skin after the fever broke. Other terrifying symptoms included a swollen tongue, often called strawberry tongue. Sore throat so painful it made swallowing impossible. Delirium caused by high fever, joint pain and swelling, and in the worst cases, death. Even those who survived could suffer long-term complications like rheumatic fever, heart damage, or kidney failure, all invisible wounds that carried into adulthood. Misunderstood and feared medieval doctors had no idea what caused scarlet fever. Some believed it came from bad air, others thought it was a form of measles or smallpox. Many believed it was punishment for sin, especially when it struck noble families or religious households. Treatments ranged from useless to horrifying. Bloodletting, again. Herbal poultices made from garlic, vinegar, and honey. Forced sweating under thick blankets, drinking mixtures of crushed pearls and wine. None of it worked. Parents watched helplessly as their children screamed in pain. Some whispered prayers, others tried to hide their sick children, fearing neighbors would blame them for spreading the disease. Impact on society. Scarlet fever left deep scars, both physical and psychological. Entire generations were affected. Families mourned multiple children lost within weeks. Villages became silent places where laughter was rare. Survivors often bore the marks of the disease for life, peeling skin, weakened bodies, and memories of suffering. In some areas, midwives and local healers developed early warning systems, watching for signs of infection and advising isolation when possible. But without modern medicine, these efforts were limited. Legacy of pain. Though scarlet fever is treatable today with antibiotics, in medieval times, it was a silent killer hiding in every home. It reminded people that even the smallest illness could turn deadly, that a simple sore throat could lead to death, that no family was safe. And if your child woke up with a red rash, you prayed, because that was all you could do. You've survived plague and leprosy, escaped smallpox, cholera, typhus, and syphilis, outlived tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, ergotism, and scarlet fever. But now, your child wakes up with a high fever. They're coughing, sneezing, their eyes burn. Then comes the rash, red, angry, spreading fast. This was measles, one of the most contagious and deadly diseases of the medieval world. And for children, It was often a death sentence. A childhood killer. In the modern world, measles is preventable with vaccines. In the Middle Ages, it was a nightmare. Measles spread like wildfire through homes, villages, and monasteries. One infected person could infect 15 to 20 others if they weren't immune. Children were hit hardest. Their immune systems were weak. Their bodies were already struggling from poor nutrition and constant exposure to other diseases. And once measles took hold, there was no escape. Symptoms that left no mercy. The disease began like a severe cold. High fever, runny nose, coughing, red, watery eyes. Then came the rash, bright red spots that started on the face and spread across the body. But unlike today, where we can manage symptoms with fluids and medicine, medieval people had nothing. No painkillers, no antibiotics, no way to stop secondary infections. And those secondary infections were what really killed. Measles weakened the immune system so much that it left victims open to pneumonia, ear infections, blindness, and even encephalitis, brain swelling. Some children died within days. Others survived, but never recovered fully. Blindness, deafness, brain damage, all possible after effects. Misunderstood and feared. Medieval doctors didn't understand viruses. They thought measles was caused by bad air, witchcraft, or divine punishment. Some believed it was a form of smallpox. Others thought it was just a milder version of the same disease. Treatments ranged from useless to horrifying. Bloodletting, again. Herbal teas made from garlic and vinegar, rubbing the skin with animal fat, placing hot cloths on the forehead to draw out the fever. None of it worked. Parents watched helplessly as their children screamed in pain, burned with fever, and faded away. Some communities tried to isolate sick children, locking them in separate rooms or sending them to live with monks or nuns who cared for the ill. But with no real understanding of how measles spread, isolation rarely worked. Impact on society. Measles wasn't just a disease. It was a shadow over every family. During outbreaks, entire villages mourned multiple deaths in a single week. Weddings were postponed, festivals canceled, churches filled with grieving parents. Survivors lived in fear of future waves. Because unlike smallpox, which you only caught once, measles could return, especially if your body was already weak. Monks and healers kept records of the worst outbreaks. Some described entire orphanages emptied by measles. Others wrote of towns where not a single child escaped infection, and because there was no cure, people turned to superstition. They hung garlic above doors, burned incense to cleanse the air, carried charms blessed by priests. They prayed, they begged, they cried, and still, the disease took its toll. Legacy of suffering measles shaped medieval life in ways we barely remember today. It taught people that childhood was not a time of safety, but of risk, that joy could turn to grief overnight, that even the smallest illness could end a life. Today, we have vaccines, we have medicine, we have knowledge, but in the Middle Ages, there was only fear. And if your child woke up with a fever, you knew. The fight had begun. You've survived plague and leprosy, escaped smallpox, cholera, typhus, and syphilis, outlived tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, ergotism, scarlet fever, and measles. But now, you wake up with a sudden chill. Your body aches like you've been beaten. Your head throbs, your breath comes short, and no matter how many blankets you pull over yourself, the fever won't break. This was influenza, or as medieval people called it, the sweating sickness. And though it wasn't always deadly, it could be just as terrifying as any other disease. A silent enemy. Unlike the plague or smallpox, influenza didn't leave visible scars. It didn't rot your flesh or fill your lungs with blood, but it made everyone sick at once. One day your village is normal. The next, people are collapsing in the streets, coughing, shivering, sweating through their clothes. No one knew what caused it. Some believed it came from bad air. Others thought it was punishment from God for immoral behavior. A few guessed it spread through touch, but without understanding germs, there was no way to stop it. What made influenza so dangerous in medieval times? It struck fast. It hit hard. And it left victims weak and vulnerable to secondary infections like pneumonia, which often killed them. Symptoms that terrified towns. Influenza in the Middle Ages wasn't just the flu we know today. It was often more severe, sometimes even epidemic-level strains that swept through towns like wildfire. Victims experienced sudden high fever, severe muscle pain, headaches so intense they felt like their skull would crack open, chills followed by drenching sweats. Extreme fatigue, some couldn't get out of bed for days, dry, hacking coughs that lasted weeks. For the strong, recovery might take weeks. For the weak, especially children, the elderly, and those already sick, it could mean death. Medieval doctors had no idea what they were dealing with. They used the same treatments for everything. Bloodletting, again, herbal teas made from garlic, onion, and vinegar, rubbing the body with animal fat, wrapping patients in thick wool blankets to sweat out the illness. None of it helped. Mostly, it made things worse. The sweating sickness outbreaks. There were times when influenza mutated into something even more deadly, known as the sweating sickness. These outbreaks were terrifying. People went to sleep healthy and woke up dead. The disease spread rapidly through crowded cities, monasteries, and royal courts. Entire noble families died within days. Even kings weren't safe. During the reign of Henry VIII, England suffered multiple waves of the sweating sickness. Panic spread. People locked themselves indoors. Priests refused to visit the sick out of fear. Survivors described the horror. Men fell ill in the morning, and by nightfall, they were cold in their beds. There was no warning, no protection, only fear. Impact on daily life. Influenza didn't kill as many as the Black Death, but it shaped medieval life in quieter ways. Schools closed during outbreaks. Markets emptied. Weddings and festivals were postponed. Families hid the sick in hopes of avoiding quarantine. Tradespeople lost work when they couldn't leave their homes. Farmers missed harvest seasons. Cities suffered economically. And because influenza returned year after year, people lived in constant dread of winter. Each autumn, rumors began to spread. Did you hear? Old Thomas started shaking again? Mary's son hasn't woken up in 2 days. And then the cough begins. Legacy of fear. Influenza may not have been the most dramatic disease of the Middle Ages, but it was one of the most persistent. It reminded people that even invisible enemies could destroy lives, that no one was truly safe, and if you woke up one morning feeling fine, you still had to ask yourself, would you make it to tomorrow? You've survived the plague, escaped leprosy's exile, outlived smallpox, cholera, typhus, and syphilis, avoided tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, ergotism, scarlet fever, measles, and influenza. But now, you're a farmer. Your cows are sick. So is your sheep. And now, so are you. This was anthrax, one of the most silent yet deadly diseases to strike medieval farmers, tanners, and anyone who worked with animals. A killer in the fields. Anthrax wasn't like the plague or smallpox. It didn't sweep through cities or kill in waves. It struck quietly, on farms, in stables, and in workshops where animal hides were processed. It came from infected livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, horses. When an animal died, its body became a ticking time bomb. Medieval people had no idea that the disease was caused by bacteria, Bacillus anthracis, which could survive for years in soil and animal remains. All they knew? Something was killing their animals, and then it started killing them too. 3 ways to die. Anthrax could attack in 3 terrifying ways. 1. Cutaneous, skin. Anthrax. You touched infected meat or hide. A small sore appeared, painless at first, but within days it turned into a black, rotting ulcer, known as a malignant pustule. Victims watched their own skin die before their eyes. 2. Gastrointestinal anthrax. You ate undercooked meat from an infected animal, your stomach burned, you vomited blood, your intestines rotted from the inside out. 3. Pulmonary inhalation. Anthrax. The deadliest of all. You inhaled spores while working with wool, hides, or bones. Within days, you developed pneumonia-like symptoms. Then came high fever, internal bleeding, and suffocation. There was no cure, no medicine, just suffering, misunderstandings, and panic. Medieval doctors had no idea what caused anthrax. Some believed it was punishment for mistreating animals. Others thought it came from eating cursed meat. Many blamed witches or evil spirits. Farmers whispered stories of entire herds dropping dead overnight. Workers in tanneries and wool mills fell ill without warning. Treatments were useless and often made things worse. Bloodletting, again, poultices made from crushed herbs and animal dung, drinking mixtures of vinegar and garlic, rubbing infected skin with hot irons to draw out the poison. None of it worked. People died not knowing what killed them. Impact on daily life. Anthrax wasn't just a disease, it was a threat to survival. For farmers, losing even one animal meant hunger. Losing a whole herd? Disaster. For tanners, wool workers, and butchers, it was a job with deadly risks. They handled hides and carcasses every day, unaware that a single cut or breath could mean death. Villages sometimes burned infected animals to stop the spread. Priests blessed fields and barns. Families fled if someone showed symptoms. But without understanding germs or infection control, there was no escape. Legacy of fear. Anthrax left behind more than death. It left fear. Farmers feared their own animals. Workers feared their tools. Parents feared letting children near livestock. Even today, anthrax is considered a dangerous biological weapon. But in medieval times, it was just another invisible killer hiding in everyday life. And if you worked with animals, you never knew when your turn would come. You've survived plague and leprosy, escaped smallpox, cholera, typhus, and syphilis, outlived tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, ergotism, scarlet fever, measles, influenza, anthrax. But now, winter has come. The wind howls through the cracks in your wooden home. Snow piles up outside. Your breath fogs in the air. And then it starts. A cough, a chill, a burning in your chest. This was pneumonia, one of the most silent but deadly diseases of the medieval world. The winter death pneumonia didn't strike with dramatic rashes or hallucinations. It crept in slowly, quietly, and often it killed without warning. In medieval Europe, winter wasn't just cold. It was a killer. Homes were poorly insulated. Clothing was rough wool and linen, not enough to keep out the damp and frost. People lived packed together in one-room huts, sharing body heat and germs. Once pneumonia took hold, there was no escape. Symptoms that stole your breath. Pneumonia inflames the lungs, filling them with fluid and making every breath a struggle. Medieval victims experienced high fever, shaking chills, chest pain, shortness of breath, a deep, painful cough that brought up blood or thick yellow phlegm. For strong adults, it might mean weeks of bed rest and weakness. For children, the elderly, or those already sick, it meant death. Victims suffocated slowly, gasping for air even as their bodies gave up. They turned blue from lack of oxygen. Their lips cracked, their eyes rolled back. And no one could help. Misunderstandings and despair. Medieval doctors had no idea what caused pneumonia. Some believed it came from bad air. Others thought it was punishment for sin. A few blamed astrology, claiming certain planetary alignments brought sickness. Treatments were useless at best, dangerous at worst. Bloodletting, again. Drinking mixtures of garlic, vinegar, and wine. Rubbing the chest with animal fat or hot irons. Wrapping patients in thick blankets to sweat out the disease. None of it worked. All it did was delay the inevitable. Parents watched helplessly as their children died before morning light. Farmers collapsed in fields, unable to breathe. Monks whispered prayers over dying brothers in monasteries. No one was safe. Impact on daily life pneumonia wasn't just a disease. It was a seasonal horror. Every year, as winter approached, people braced themselves. Would this be the year someone in the family wouldn't survive? Would the baby make it? Would grandmother? In poor villages, families burned whatever they could find for warmth: wood, dung, even old shoes, anything to keep pneumonia at bay. But sometimes it wasn't enough. Entire homes were emptied by the disease. Gravediggers couldn't keep up with demand. Priests refused to visit the sick out of fear. Survivors lived in constant dread. Because unlike the plague or cholera, pneumonia didn't announce itself with warnings. It struck quietly, without mercy, and often without hope. Legacy of suffering pneumonia shaped medieval life in ways we rarely remember today. It reminded people that survival was never guaranteed, that even the strongest could fall to an invisible enemy, that warmth was more precious than gold. Today, we have antibiotics, we have vaccines, we have heating systems and warm clothes. But in the Middle Ages, winter was war, and pneumonia was its deadliest soldier. You've survived plague and leprosy, escaped smallpox, cholera, typhus, and syphilis, outlived tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, ergotism, scarlet fever, measles, influenza, anthrax, pneumonia. But now, you take a drink of water. It's warm, stagnant. Maybe it smells a little off, but you're thirsty. And in medieval Europe, that was enough to kill you. This was typhoid fever, one of the most silent but deadly diseases ever to haunt towns, armies, and royal courts. A hidden poison in your drink. Typhoid fever didn't announce itself with blackened fingers or rashes. It came quietly, through something you barely thought twice about: water. In the Middle Ages, clean drinking water was a myth. Rivers were sewers. Wells were dug too close to latrines. People drank from communal fountains where animals bathed and children played. And in that water lurked a killer. Salmonella typhi, the bacterium that causes typhoid, thrived in contaminated water and food. One sip, one bite. That's all it took. Once inside your body, it invaded your intestines and bloodstream. And then began the nightmare. Symptoms that crept in like death. Typhoid fever hit slowly, like a trap closing around you. First came the fever, rising day by day until you burned like a torch. Then the headaches, so intense they felt like someone hammering nails into your skull. Your stomach twisted in pain. You coughed blood. Your mind grew foggy, delirium setting in as your body failed. After a week, rose-colored spots bloomed across your chest, a sign death was near. Unlike the plague, which killed fast, typhoid dragged you down over days or weeks. Victims wasted away, eyes sunken, lips cracked, skin cold and clammy. Some died screaming in pain, others simply slipped into unconsciousness and never woke up. Misunderstandings and despair. Medieval doctors had no idea what caused typhoid. Some blamed bad air, others thought it was punishment for sin. A few believed it came from eating cursed food. Treatments were useless at best, dangerous at worst. Bloodletting, again. Drinking mixtures of vinegar and ashes, rubbing the body with hot cloths soaked in wine, wrapping patients in thick blankets to sweat out the fever. None of it worked. All it did was make things worse. Parents watched helplessly as their children faded. Farmers buried neighbors without understanding why only some got sick. Monks whispered prayers over dying brothers in monasteries. No one knew how to stop it. Impact on society. Typhoid wasn't just a disease. It was a ghost that haunted every town. It struck hardest where people lived in filth. Overcrowded cities, military camps, monasteries, royal courts, armies feared it more than enemy swords. During long campaigns, soldiers died not from battle, but from the water they drank. Kings weren't safe. King Henry I of England, known for his intelligence and political skill, may have died from typhoid after eating lampreys, a type of eel-like fish often caught in contaminated waters. His last words? "I have eaten too many of them." Even royalty couldn't escape the disease. Legacy of fear. Typhoid fever left behind more than graves. It left fear. Fear of water, fear of food, fear of the unseen. It reminded people that even the simplest act, taking a drink, could be deadly. And in the Middle Ages, there was no way to know if your next sip would be your last. You've survived plague and leprosy, escaped smallpox, cholera, typhus, and syphilis, outlived tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, ergotism, scarlet fever, measles, influenza, anthrax, pneumonia, typhoid fever. But now, you hear a sound that sends chills down your spine. A cough so violent, so relentless, it sounds like someone trying to tear their lungs out through their mouth. This was whooping cough, or pertussis, one of the most terrifying diseases to strike medieval children and adults alike. And in the Middle Ages, it was a death sentence for many. The cough that wouldn't stop. Imagine this. You wake up with what seems like a normal cold, a tickle in your throat, a slight cough. Within days, it escalates. Your body is seized by violent coughing fits. You vomit from the force. Your ribs ache. You gasp for air between coughs, making a high-pitched whoop sound as you try to breathe. This wasn't just a bad night of drinking. It wasn't just a weak stomach. It was whooping cough, a disease that could last for weeks, even months. In modern times, we have vaccines and antibiotics. In the Middle Ages, there was nothing. Just pain and fear. Symptoms that terrorized families. Whooping cough hit hardest where it hurt the most. Children. Infants and young kids were especially vulnerable. Their small bodies couldn't handle the violent spasms. Some suffocated mid-cough. Older children and adults survived longer, but not without suffering. Victims experienced violent, uncontrollable coughing fits, vomiting after coughing, broken ribs from constant strain, nosebleeds, fainting spells. In infants, pauses in breathing, known as apnea. Medieval parents watched helplessly as their children writhed in pain, unable to eat, sleep, or breathe normally. Some families tried to soothe them with herbal teas or honey. Others turned to superstition, burning herbs, hanging charms, praying to saints. None of it helped. All they could do? Wait, and hope their child would survive. Misunderstandings and despair. Medieval doctors had no idea what caused whooping cough. Some believed it came from bad air. Others thought it was punishment for sin. A few believed it was caused by evil spirits attacking the lungs. Treatments were useless at best, dangerous at worst. Bloodletting, again. Drinking mixtures of garlic, vinegar, and wine, rubbing the chest with hot irons, wrapping patients in thick wool blankets to sweat out the illness. None of it worked. Parents whispered prayers over their sick children. Monks lit candles in churches. Neighbors avoided homes where the cough had taken hold, because once it started, it spread fast. Impact on daily life. Whooping cough didn't kill as many as the Black Death, but it left deep scars. Families lived in fear of outbreaks. Schools closed when too many students fell ill. Villages mourned children lost in waves. Survivors often bore long-term damage. weakened lungs, chronic coughs, and memories of nights spent screaming for air. Even those who recovered never forgot the terror of the cough that wouldn't stop. Legacy of suffering. Whooping cough shaped medieval life in quiet ways. It reminded people that danger wasn't always visible, that something as simple as breathing could bring infection, that even the strongest body could be broken by an invisible enemy. And if your child woke up one night with a dry cough, you knew. The fight had begun. You've survived plague and leprosy, but now your leg begins to swell. At first, it's barely noticeable. A little puffiness, maybe some discomfort. Then comes the pain. Your skin tightens. Your foot grows larger. Your toes thicken. And soon, your entire limb becomes a grotesque, elephant-like mass. This was lymphatic filariasis, known in medieval times as the elephant disease. And once it took hold, there was no cure, only suffering. The parasite that stole your body. Lymphatic filariasis is caused by microscopic worms that live inside mosquitoes. When an infected mosquito bites you, it injects tiny larvae into your bloodstream. They travel to your lymphatic system, the body's natural defense network, and settle in. There, they grow into adult worms up to 4 inches long. They live for years, reproducing endlessly. Their presence blocks the flow of lymph fluid, causing massive swelling in the legs, arms, breasts, and genitals. It wasn't always deadly, but it was deforming. Victims were left with limbs so swollen and hardened they looked like stone. Skin cracked and split. Infections festered. Pain never stopped. Medieval people had no idea what caused it. Some believed it was punishment for sin. Others thought it was witchcraft or divine retribution. All they knew? Once it started, there was no going back. Symptoms that turned victims into ghosts. The disease struck slowly but mercilessly. Early symptoms included mild swelling in the feet or legs, fever and chills, pain in the groin or armpits. Over time, the condition worsened. Skin thickened and hardened like tree bark. Limbs grew to monstrous sizes. Toes fused together. Walking became impossible without pain. Men often suffered from hydrocele, where the scrotum swelled to unimaginable proportions. Women experienced disfigurement of the breasts and genitalia. Victims were often shunned, not because they were contagious, but because they were terrifying to look at. People whispered that demons had taken them, that they were cursed, that they should be avoided. Even doctors couldn't help. They tried everything. Bloodletting, again. Poultices made from crushed herbs, rubbing limbs with hot irons, wrapping legs in tight bandages to reduce swelling. None of it worked. All it did was make things worse. Impact on daily life. Lymphatic filariasis didn't kill quickly. It killed dignity. Victims lost jobs. Husbands abandoned wives. Parents feared their children would catch it. Farmers couldn't work the fields. Tradesmen were refused entry into markets. Children were kept away from schools. Many victims became beggars, wandering from town to town, hiding their limbs under heavy cloaks, hoping for pity instead of fear. Some communities tried to care for the sick. Monks and healers washed wounds and applied ointments. But without understanding parasites or mosquitoes, there was no real treatment, just suffering. Legacy of shame and suffering. Lymphatic filariasis left behind more than pain. It left stigma. Even today, the disease affects over 120 million people worldwide, mostly in tropical regions. But in medieval Europe, it was a mystery, a horror, a curse, a fate worse than death. And if you woke up one morning with a strange swelling in your foot, you already knew your life would never be the same. You've survived plague and leprosy. But now, you're walking through the village when a dog lunges at you. It's foaming at the mouth. Its eyes are wild. It bites your arm before running off into the shadows. This was rabies, one of the most terrifying diseases to strike medieval Europe, not because it was common, but because once it took hold, there was no hope, only madness and death. The madness that came from a bite. Rabies wasn't like other diseases. It didn't come from water, food, or air. It came from animals, dogs, wolves, bats, and even cats. And in a world without vaccines or modern medicine, a bite from an infected animal meant one thing: certain death. Medieval people had no idea what caused rabies. They saw only the symptoms: violent spasms, hallucinations, hydrophobia, fear of water, rage so intense victims attacked anyone near them. To witnesses, it looked like possession, like witchcraft, like the devil himself had entered the body. And there was no cure, no treatment, just waiting for the inevitable. Symptoms that turned men into monsters. Rabies struck slowly at first. After the bite, the virus traveled silently through the nervous system. For weeks, sometimes months, the victim felt fine. Then came the warning signs: headache, fever, nausea, pain at the bite site. And then, the horror began. Victims became sensitive to light and sound. They twitched uncontrollably. They experienced terrifying hallucinations, seeing demons, hearing voices, feeling invisible bugs crawling under their skin. Soon came the most famous symptom: hydrophobia. Even the sight of water could trigger violent convulsions. Victims choked at the thought of drinking. Their bodies rejected the very thing that could save them. As the disease progressed, they grew delirious. Some screamed in agony. Others turned violent, attacking family members, biting others, tearing at their own skin. Eventually, the body gave out. Heart failure, respiratory failure, death, all within days of the first symptoms. Misunderstandings and despair. Medieval doctors had no idea how to treat rabies. Some believed it was punishment for sin. Others thought it came from evil spirits entering the wound. A few believed the madness was contagious just by looking at someone infected. Treatments were cruel and useless. Burning the wound with hot irons, drinking mixtures of crushed herbs and vinegar, rubbing the bite with animal fat, wrapping the victim in wet cloths soaked in wine. None of it worked. Once the disease started, there was no going back. Families locked victims in rooms to stop them from hurting others. Priests prayed over them, hoping divine intervention might help. Neighbors fled, fearing they too might catch the madness. In some towns, victims were buried alive, believed to be already dead from the inside. Impact on daily life. Rabies wasn't widespread in medieval Europe, but when it did appear, panic followed. Dogs were both companions and threats. Used for hunting, guarding homes, and herding livestock, they were everywhere. But when a dog went mad, people knew what was coming. Entire villages would chase down and kill any animal suspected of being rabid. Bites were treated as death sentences. Some communities developed early warnings. If a dog barked strangely, if it walked in circles, if its jaw hung loose and drool poured out, these signs were enough to raise alarm bells across town. Children were warned never to approach strange animals. Farmers kept weapons near their beds at night. Monks wrote records of mad dog attacks as if they were omens of doom. Legacy of fear. Rabies left behind more than graves. It left terror, fear of animals, fear of the unknown, fear of losing your mind before your life. Today, we have vaccines. We know rabies can be prevented with timely care. But in the Middle Ages, a bite from a mad dog wasn't just an injury, it was a death sentence, a slow descent into madness, a fate worse than war. And if you were bitten, you already knew. Your time had run out. You've survived plague and leprosy, escaped smallpox, cholera, typhus, and syphilis, outlived tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, ergotism, scarlet fever, measles, influenza, anthrax, pneumonia, typhoid fever, whooping cough, lymphatic filariasis, rabies. But now, your skin burns. It starts as a red patch, small, harmless. Then it spreads, fast. Your face swells, your skin tightens. You feel like you're on fire from the inside out. This was erysipelas, one of the most painful and terrifying bacterial infections to strike medieval Europe. And unlike other diseases that came with fever or coughing fits, erysipelas announced itself with agony. The fire that couldn't be put out. Erysipelas is caused by the same bacteria responsible for strep throat, Streptococcus pyogenes. It enters the body through cuts, wounds, or insect bites, and once in, it goes straight for the skin. Victims described the sensation as like molten lead under my flesh. The infection spread rapidly, often covering large parts of the body within hours. The skin turned bright red, hot to the touch, and swollen beyond recognition. Most commonly affected areas? Face, especially around the eyes and nose. Legs, arms, any exposed wound. In medieval times, there was no understanding of bacteria or infection. People believed the disease came from bad air, witchcraft, divine punishment for sin, poisoned food, cursed water. Some towns even thought it was contagious just by looking at someone infected. Symptoms that terrified towns. Erysipelas didn't kill as many as the plague, but it left survivors with memories of unbearable pain. Early symptoms included sudden high fever, chills, headache, nausea. Then came the worst part, the skin attack. Redness appeared like flames crawling across the body. It burned, it throbbed, it swelled. Victims couldn't close their eyes if the infection reached their face. Their lips grew so thick they couldn't speak. Their fingers and toes puffed up until they looked like sausages. There were no antibiotics, no painkillers, no way to stop it. All you could do? Suffer. Misunderstandings and despair. Medieval doctors had no idea what caused erysipelas. Some believed it was a form of leprosy. Others thought it came from touching cursed objects. A few believed it was sent by God to punish immoral behavior. Treatments ranged from useless to horrifying. Bloodletting. Again. Poultices made from garlic, vinegar, and animal dung. Rubbing the infected area with hot irons, wrapping the victim in wet cloths soaked in wine or urine. None of it worked. In fact, some treatments made things worse, turning minor infections into full-blown sepsis. Families avoided touching victims, fearing they might catch whatever was burning them alive. Monks recorded cases in monastery ledgers, describing patients who screamed for days without relief. Parents watched helplessly as children writhed in bed, unable to sleep or eat. There was no mercy, only pain. Impact on daily life. Erysipelas struck everywhere, especially where hygiene was poor. Hospitals, if they existed, filled with victims. Farmers abandoned fields, too sick to work. Soldiers died before reaching battle. Because the infection often started with a simple cut or scratch, anyone could be next. A farmer cutting hay, a blacksmith hammering metal, a child falling and scraping their knee. That's all it took. Once the infection began, there was no telling how far it would go. Some recovered after weeks of agony, others weren't so lucky. Complications included abscesses forming under the skin, gangrene, permanent disfigurement, blindness. If the infection reached the eyes, survivors often bore scars, not just physical, but psychological. They remembered the fire and feared it would return. Legacy of pain. Erysipelas may not have been the deadliest disease of the Middle Ages, but it was among the most feared. It reminded people that danger wasn't always invisible. Sometimes it started with something as simple as a scrape, something every person encountered daily. Today we treat it with antibiotics. We recognize it early. We prevent it with basic hygiene. But in the Middle Ages, a simple cut could mean weeks of suffering, months of recovery, or death. And if you woke up with a red patch on your face, you already knew the fire had come. You've survived everything, from plague to lepra, from syphilis to rabies, from malaria to emphysema. Every disease is not just a diagnosis. It's a story of suffering written in blood, pain, and fear. But you know what? You survived. And you realized one important thing. The Middle Ages was a nightmare from which we have yet to awaken. A world without knowledge, a world without defense. All these diseases had one thing in common. They killed because people didn't know. Didn't know about bacteria, didn't know about viruses, didn't know about hygiene, antiseptics, or antibiotics. They treated themselves with bloodletting. They drank vinegar and ash. They took urine as medicine. And every day was a battle. Not against enemies, but against ignorance. Contrast that with today. Imagine a picture. You wake up in the morning, you have a fever, you have a headache. Somewhere inside, an infection is stirring. What do? You pick up the phone, you call your doctor, and in a few hours, you have a diagnosis, medication, and hope. Now imagine instead, you're living in the year 1350. You feel the first signs of infection. You're getting worse. You cough. You're running a fever, and no one can help you. Your friends whisper. Your family starts to stay away from you. You're alone. And you know that if you're lucky, you'll just die quietly. If not, you'll suffer for weeks or months. What survives? Some diseases have disappeared thanks to science. Others remain, but we've learned to live with them. Vaccines save millions of lives. Antibiotics have turned deadly infections into simple cases. Sanitation, hygiene, running water, electricity have all become a norm we often take for granted. But in the Middle Ages, a cold could kill. A wound could be fatal. Even a simple inflammation could turn into slow, agonizing agony. The value of what we have. When we look at the past, it's easy to say, how did they live like that? But the right question to ask is, how did we forget how lucky we were? You can drink water from the tap. You can buy medicine at the drugstore. You can call a doctor. You can get an immunization. You can be treated at home without hiding from your neighbors. You can survive. A history lesson, not for fear, but for gratitude. We didn't talk about the horrors of medieval life to scare you, but to remind us, welfare, security, health is not a given. It's a conquest. It's the result of centuries of science, mistakes, suffering, and progress. You wouldn't have survived a day in the Middle Ages, but you live in a world where that day is no longer coming. Final look. Sometimes it feels like our world is too complicated, too noisy, too confusing. But it's still better than one where every scratch is potential death, where every sip of water is a risk of infection, where every person around you is a potential carrier of death. So the next time you're having a hard time, think about where you could be, and say thank you to the person who made the first prescription, who performed the first surgery, who discovered the first microbe, because thanks to them, you can live at all.